I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And I'm Rachel Bovard.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common sense and common good meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And on a quick aside, please also register if you have not already done so for NatCon 2, October 31st and November 2nd in Orlando, Florida. So as usual, we have a broad-ranging, substantively diverse, and surely intellectually energizing conversation for you today. We're going to start off with Rachel talking about inflation. It isn't transitory, it's here to stay. I'm going to talk about this eye-opening report that Aaron Siberium of the Washington Free Beacon has provided out of Yale Law School. Emily is going to talk about what's happening in Loudoun County with a rape allegation. And then Ben is going to talk about the latest with the Chinese Communist Party and big tech's collusion with the Chinese Communist Party with removing an app there. So without further ado, let's kick it over to you, Rachel, to talk about inflation.
So this is something I think that has been on a lot of people's minds for a while since we saw the consumer price index inflation count start to tick up beginning earlier this year. And, new reports now have it, I think, at the highest point in decades. And that's consumer goods, right? So we've seen asset inflation for a long time. So we've seen home prices rise, university costs going up, but we're now actually seeing it sort of day to day. And I wanted to bring it up because the Fed for a long time has said, well, this is just transitory. That's what they call it, transitory inflation. It'll go away. It's a sort of blip on the radar responding to the economy reopening from COVID. And as soon as people go back to work, as soon as we get the pandemic under control, as soon as schools reopen, everything will smooth back out. That isn't happening. And it hasn't been happening for the last couple of months. And the reason I wanted to bring it up was because I see a lot of the very reductive talking points on both the right and the left. So the left is like, this isn't really an issue. You just need to pay workers more. You need to mint the coin. Everything will be fine. And the right is simply saying, well, it's because everybody's stuck at home and, we need everybody back to work. And that's what will bring, the supply chains back and compensate for this massive demand. And I actually think both of them are reductive in missing sort of the really broad context of structural issues that we are facing down in this economy, to the extent that I think we are kind of running up against, I think, what could be a economic crisis such that we really haven't seen since 2008. But it's monetary, but it's also structural. And nobody, I think, is really talking about sort of the context in which all of this is taking place. So very briefly, I'll just hit on some points I think that are driving this. And the first is that there is just boatloads of money sloshing around in the economy. And, everybody's like, oh, once it gets through the economy, from the CARES 1.0 and CARES 2.0, well, it's not going to get through the economy for decades. I mean, you have states that are sitting on billions of dollars. I mean, even just look back to sort of the rental and eviction crisis when everyone's saying, oh, we have to extend the eviction moratorium, not even recognizing that the states themselves are just sitting on $46 billion in rental assistance that's not even through the pipeline. And you have orders of magnitude larger than that when it comes to, all kinds of COVID relief. These blue states can now pay enhanced unemployment. Even if the federal match goes away, they can pay state enhanced unemployment for decades at this point. So you just have massive, massive amounts of money floating out there. You also, though, have, I think, really structural inefficiencies with our supply chains. We've talked a lot about supply chains in the past couple of days. We're recording this on a Monday. At the end of last week, it came out that Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg had been on paternity leave for 2 months during this crisis and nobody noticed. But even setting that issue aside, he's come out and said, oh, the supply chains, it'll be with us, but, we'll move on from it. What COVID laid bare was how inefficient this system is by means of just outsourcing everything. We can't make anything here in the United States anymore. So we're relying on these economies overseas that themselves haven't even come back. But even when they ship things to us, you have bottlenecks right now, particularly at the Port of LA and the Port of Long Beach, where barges are just sitting offshore, unable to be unloaded. And that itself has to be unpacked structurally because you have a labor problem there, right? You have unions who are using COVID as an excuse not to work. The federal government just had to step in and, negotiate the port to operate on a 24-hour basis. But you also have massive carbon emission laws that are preventing trucks from picking up that cargo and shipping it across the country. So there's many other areas I think I could touch on here, from the labor side, from the supply side, from just our ability to even make things at home and then transport them around the country. But my point in bringing this up is that none of this can be discussed in a very reductive framing. We have a massive economic structural problem here that I don't think we're necessarily going to get through in the next 2, 5, or 10 years. And I think that sort of augurs poorly for our ability to recover from this crisis. So I'm open to debate on this because this is a subject of debate on the right now.
So I'm happy to take first stab at that. So inflation is horrifying. Okay. I mean, and the problem, or there are many reasons why inflation is horrifying. One is that, a lot of us on the right are trying to kind of obviously help this realignment, where the GOP and conservatism in general is trying to be kind of like a more kind of multiracial working class party, to use kind of the label of the popular label of the day. The problem is that inflation disproportionately actually hits harder with working class, kind of those deplorables and the heartland people, because they don't have access to the same level of obviously like 401k, ETF. They're not going to be able to kind of get some like sexy hedge fund to manage their like $1 trillion AUM and assets under management or anything like that. They're inherently just going to be riding out the volatilities of their real assets and their financial assets depreciating in real time more. So it really kind of hits home from that perspective as well. Look, I mean, the classic definition of inflation, to go back to like Econ Theory 101, is too much money chasing too few goods. And as Rachel just, I think, quite aptly and accurately laid out, that's literally what has happened for the past year and a half here. Governments are sloshing money around. And because of all the supply chain issues and the bottlenecks and the lockdowns, by the way, just this week in Newsweek, I have this great piece from Philip Pilkington, who's, I think he lives in London. He's a macroeconomist there, arguing that the lockdowns themselves have actually exacerbated our inflation. What he argues is actually stagflation, because it just exacerbates the supply chain bottleneck. So in that classic definition of too much money chasing too few goods, the COVID era policies, holding aside the structural supply chain issues, the lockdowns themselves, and he even argues the mandates have even exacerbated that. So it really is kind of a total crap show, for lack of a better term here. The problem is that our central bankers, whether it's the Fed, the ECB, European Central Bank, or central bankers all around the world, don't seem to be waking up and responding as they should be. If anything, they're maintaining this de facto ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, where with skyrocketing inflation, that's like negative real interest rates. And it's been the same thing now, effectively, like since QE1 after the crash in 0809. I mean, like, and I maybe Ben, who used to work on Wall Street, can explain this a little better than I can. I don't, for the life of me, understand what is going on with our central bankers. I mean, like, the time would be now to start raising interest rates, probably by a decent amount. But I'll get off my soapbox at this point, because I don't have a good explanation for why they're not doing exactly that.
On the Wall Street point, it's well taken to raise it. Wall Street, of course, loves having zero or negative real interest rates in perpetuity because, of course, financial services gets its hands on this cheap money first and is able to allocate it accordingly. So then when ultimately the dominoes fall down the road, certainly some banks may be left holding the bad assets, but in reality, the problems that manifest themselves ultimately hurt those far further down the chain in terms of the deployment and the allocation of capital. Everyone ought to just take a look at the money supply charts that the Fed puts out, and you can see over time, there's sort of a gentle increase. And in the last 5 years, it's like a straight line up, essentially. And it really speaks for itself in terms of one of the contributing factors to price inflation, which is, of course, a consequence of monetary inflation. Print more money. If you're not generating economic output, outpacing that or at something roughly approximating it, of course, you're going to have massive inflation in prices. And then, yes, of course, the pandemic itself exacerbates this. Also, to Josh's point, inflation is the most regressive of all taxes, in particular because of all people, it hurts most those on a fixed income. So, you're going to be paid in dollars that are going to continually be depreciating. It hurts savers, obviously. And so why are low interest rates the sole focus, essentially, of central bankers and the rest? Because we are, unfortunately, in my view, a debt-based economy, a debt-based society. Our government has encouraged it. Our financial services institutions have incorporated it. It leads to rapidly rising asset prices in perpetuity. But again, to go back to the financial crisis of 07, 08, 09 and beyond, really, we just papered over our problems, essentially, with that zero interest rate policy and the Fed buying all manner of bad assets and the like. Effectively, at the end of the day, I think there's a good case to be made that we just blew a bigger bubble over the next decade following that financial crisis. And once inflation is out of the bag, it's not clear necessarily how it's going to end, but I see zero will among our central bankers or political class or beyond to do what will be necessary to strangle inflation if this really is going to be a horrible episode of it. It's unimaginable that we'd have interest rates at 10% or 20% or beyond, but we've been here before in the 70s when we were in a far better fiscal stance, far better fiscal position, and early 80s as well. Ultimately, this could be the story among the stories about our economics. What happens when the dollar is worthless? And what does that mean for our geopolitical position? And what does that mean for all the other nations out there who hold all of our debts? I mean, this is going to have massive implications all the way down the road once we get even well beyond this whole supply chain crisis that we're dealing with right now.
I'll just quickly say that, and it's not as though most of our debt is held by China, but our friend Sagar and Jetty just tweeted a link to the Asia Times, and it says U.S. import dependency on China is now, quote, the sort of import dependency economists associate with third world countries dependent on former colonial powers. That is the stage of the game. That's where we are. And in this entire conversation about infrastructure, which our department of our head of the transportation department has been absent for this entire thing, there's no conversation about supply chains. If there is, it's minimal. We're just talking about more debt, which the Biden administration claims won't exist because they have BS excuses for how they're going to raise the money. We all know that child tax credit is not going to expire if it's implemented for 5 years. We just know that's not going to happen. This is just completely reckless. And it's not just reckless because, modern monetary theory is, nonsense, blah, blah, blah. It's reckless because we're tying this debt to other countries, some of which are our enemies. And we're creating a situation where another COVID could absolutely wreck us in worse circumstances because we have global supply chains and we can't make our own stuff here. So this is not my area of expertise, but I can just add that perspective to underscore what the rest of you have said.
So real quick before we transition to my segment, just to tie a quick bow on this, what the irony, of course, is that on the one hand, what Ben, I think, accurately describes like a debt-based society, a debt-based government, which obviously is what the U.S. is and has been for most of the post-World War II era, obviously. The irony is that they basically love inflation, right? Because it decreases the real value of the debts that they owe. The irony of that is that when it starts to skyrocket like this for the first time in 30, 40 years, people really do feel in a concrete way. And I personally predict, I've been saying this for months now, that it will be the single issue that costs Democrats at the ballot box next fall. But we'll see. But we now have spent too much time on inflation, so let's do a segment here. So I want to talk a little bit about what I thought was an eye-opening story that Aaron Siberium of the Washington Free Beacon, who is just a fabulous reporter, by the way, very, very sharp young guy. I don't know how old he is, probably mid to late 20s, but definitely give him a follow his work at Washington Free Beacon. He had this report where he's reporting on what really just looks kind of like an old school kind of Stalinist-esque witch hunt from my perspective, from my reading of what happened at Yale Law School, which has been the top ranked law school in the country since the law school rankings were started in like the late 1980s. It's kind of the undisputed top place. It is oppressively woke in every sense of the term there. I'm not even sure if they have like a nominal right of center faculty member. I literally am not sure off the top of my head, to be honest with you. So anyway, basically what happened here at Yale Law School is a second-year law student who I take it is a descendant of the Cherokee tribe, the Oklahoma-based Cherokee tribe that Elizabeth Warren thinks she's a descendant of, but might not be. He's a member of the Native American Law Students Association and the Federal Society, which has come up on this podcast a lot. It's kind of like the token kind of right of center legal organization that exists on law school campuses, lawyers chapters and whatnot. So this guy who's a member of both the Native American Law Student Society and FedSoc sends an all school wide email. And this is in September, it's before Constitution Day, which is, obviously the annual anniversary of the signing of the Constitution in Philadelphia in 1787. So he's sending this school-wide email that reads, quote, "We will be christening our very own soon-to-be world-renowned Native American Law Society Trap House by throwing a Constitution Day bash in collaboration with FedSoc." The email then also added that the event would include, quote, "American-themed snacks such as Popeye's chicken and apple pie." Now, apparently, maybe one of you guys are a little more culturally, perhaps this is Emily's area, maybe you're a little more culturally in the weeds than I am. Apparently, trap house is like a term that I guess gained notoriety in like some rap song like 5 or 6 years ago, and originally had like a drug acquisition connotation, but is now taken to just be like a place to hang out and like drink a beer or whatever. Anyway, long story short, because of that and the Popeye's chicken, the president of the Black Law Students Association then responds all in this kind of school-wide online forum, quote, "I guess celebrating whiteness wasn't enough. Y'all had to upgrade to cosplay/blackface." Long story short, within 12 hours, the student was summoned to kind of the Office of Student Affairs, where there's like a professional diversity dean, which all these law schools, all these universities in general have, with the kind of their Title VI offices and Title IX offices, and the whole sprawling civil rights apparatus, which Chris Caldwell, of course, has written about at great length in a recent book that most of us here, I'm sure, cannot recommend highly enough. And the diversity crowd basically says that you've triggered your classmates and you really ought to apologize. And the student basically ends up saying, well, no, if someone has an issue with this, they can just come to me individually. And like, I will explain that this is like a totally innocuous thing. It's literally just like a party invitation, right? And so the professional diversity crowd basically then drafts an apology herself, offers it to this guy in like true, like kind of Stalinist kind of like show trial, from my perspective, kind of fashion, and says, no, you should sign this because, quote, "I don't want to make our office look like an ineffective source of resolution." Which basically is exactly kind of, this really validates the entire thesis of Heather McDonald's 2018 book, The Diversity Delusion, where she talks about how the professional diversity apparatus in higher ed and increasingly in corporate America in general really just exists for the sake to be professional Torquemedas, to be professional kind of roving Inquisition style people to enforce the various and ever-changing diktats of the intersectional hierarchy. So I thought this was like an eye-opening story. It's really revealing. Good reporting by Aaron to show how the diversity apparatus on higher ed actually works here. I'm happy to kind of throw it open at that. I mean, I see no reason, honestly, for kind of like the campus and university left, and by extension, the corporate left, to engage in this level of kind of sordid tactics, other than just to make the other side, feel pain, because they've already won. The campus is over, okay? Buckley wrote "Got a Man" at Yale in the early 1950s. Like, this has been a lost cause now for like 2 or 3 generations. So I think they just want us to feel pain, but I'm happy to be proven wrong on that if maybe any of you guys disagree.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in here. And I work at YAF, so I work on these issues and I work with students a lot. And I think actually what we underestimate, and I know we've talked about this on the podcast before, something I think we underestimate is the degree to which people in Gen Z and younger millennials have been conditioned by all of our institutions before people were paying attention in 2020 to see the world this way. And I think these complaints are shockingly sincere. These complaints that talking about Popeyes and a trap house, like these complaints that constitutes racism, they're shockingly sincere because people have been told and they've been conditioned to see that as racism literally for years by every institution in our society. And we have to sort of keep that in mind, because when people are looting and rioting, a lot of it is just like, it's fun. It's, male aggression, it's convenience, and, this sort of visceral idea about reparations. But people like actually have been told by every institution that they are drowning in racism and sexism and patriarchy every single second of the day. And that informs a lot of this. And we sort of saw what happened when the first wave of millennials hit the workforce. But I don't think we're going to see what happens. I don't think we fully understand what's going to happen when Gen Z hits the workforce, the generation that has been conditioned by the elder millennials and by the boomers and by the Xers to believe that they are, and every single institution to believe that they are the victims of this continuing. We have the president of the United States calling the voting legislation proposed by Republicans Jim Crow 2.0 and Jim Eagle. And it's not just him, it is every leading Democrat and all of the media institutions. They're using comparisons that dramatic, and that should tell you how comfortable they've gotten making these hyperbolic statements that are not tethered in reality. That's the reality that a lot of these kids lived in, and it's been impressed on them by every single institution. And so I think these are sort of shockingly sincere complaints, and that's the thing to kind of keep in mind going forward.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't going away. This isn't a one-off. And I think that's what's so scary about it being at Yale, is that this is our next generation's elite. Like these are the people that are going to clerk at the Supreme Court and run the major corporations and probably run for office and be elected. And this is what they're being taught and affirmed. When they do this behavior is affirmed. And I really think it's like there's been this sort of affinity or impulse to just be like, college kids, whatever happens on campuses, it's cute, whatever. And then people grow up. No, this is what they're growing up to be. Like the adults in charge are feeding and fanning this. And I think that's what makes this so scary, because this isn't going away. This is a phenomenon. Like you are taking James Bennett in the New York Times newsroom and multiplying it times 50. And this is what we're up against. And it scares me, to be frank. This is like this is a new style of cancel culture that we haven't seen in the institutions.
I think everyone's points are well taken, particularly on the fact that this is precisely the poisonous well from which all of society is now drinking as we go through this woke anti-cultural revolution across all of the power sectors of society. I think that the offices of diversity, equity, inclusion ought to be thought of as the enforcement arm of our cultural Marxist betters, nothing more, nothing less. And it's worth noting, by the way, that one of the reasons we talked about college education's the price massively increasing in recent decades, that's largely gone to administrators. And of course, under administrators, that's offices of diversity, equity, inclusion. So it's also a racket on top of the fact that it's an enforcement arm as well. And I think that's worth noting. So, there's got to be a defund elite educational institution movement at some point, because we're effectively funding our intellectual demise as a country. But of course, this goes back decades, generations, really, to Josh's points. To my great shame, I have not read Whittaker Chambers' Witness start to finish in the past, but I'm going through that exercise right now. And it strikes me that an episode like this really does reflect that sort of Stalinist mindset on the campuses. And that mindset requires constantly reinforcing the need to hold the correct views, even if it's completely inconsistent on a case-by-case basis, on a year-by-year basis, even if it's constantly accelerating, devolving in one direction or another, constantly reinforcing the party line and ensuring that anyone who steps from it is meted with serious justice is exactly the Stalinist kind of view. And what's remarkable and also quite sobering is that if you go back and look at Witness by Whittaker Chambers, the things that we're seeing today have been existing and perpetuating themselves, reinforcing themselves for decades upon decades. So needless to say, we've got our work cut out for us.
Yeah, and the problem's not going away anytime soon, obviously, right? So, I mean, I would encourage the listeners of this podcast to go back and read a fabulous essay in National Affairs in 2020 that our friend Arthur Millick wrote entitled, quote, "Preventing Suicide by Higher Education." Literally the phraseology of suicide. And the fact, by the way, that was in Yuval Levin's National Affairs, not kind of some like fringe, like far right outlet, whatever, shows that like we on the right, I think increasingly are at least intellectually waking up to the threat posed by higher ed. It's just time to actually get in the weeds and actually start legislating and actually doing something about it. But let's transition from higher ed to the public school bureaucracy in Loudoun County, Virginia. So Emily, why don't you tell us about what's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a perfect transition because this is the consequence of the same rotten fruit of this cultural leftist ideology. And sadly, in this case, it's affecting very young students. Now, we're talking about reports from the Daily Wire that are real bombshells in Loudoun County, Virginia, which is outside DC. It's just west of Fairfax County, which is like literally right outside DC. And so if you're going west from DC, you could get to Loudoun in about 45 minutes. So that's sort of, it's a suburb, but it's also semi-rural and kind of a newly bluish, purplish place, but fairly split between the rural parts and the more privileged parts. And so we're talking about this father, Scott Smith, who was arrested at a Loudoun County school board meeting back in June because it was deemed a, quote, unlawful assembly. Scott was sort of plastered all over the media at the time as this like angry dad, this angry energy, this threat to the safety of school boards. Well, on May 28th, Smith said a boy that was wearing a skirt entered a girl's restroom at a high school and sexually assaulted his 9th grade daughter. Now, per the Daily Wire's Luke Rosiak, juvenile records are sealed, but Smith's attorney Elizabeth Lancaster told the Daily Wire that a boy was charged with 2 counts of forcible sodomy, 1 count of anal sodomy, and 1 count of forcible fellatio. And that is obviously a graphic and detailed description of what happened, but I think it's necessary to reinforce the point that this is a, quote, gender fluid student who used the accommodations that we have been forced to accept for people who identify as such in order to rape a girl. The father was arrested when he tried to basically speak out at a school board about that, a school board meeting about that. And so there's a lot of things going on in this story, and you can see how the ideology is being weaponized, actively weaponized, not only to bulldoze our culture with this ideology, but to shut up anybody who, to suppress any opposition to it, no matter how reasonable, no matter how personal. It's sort of, they've got both, they're working on both of those fronts, not only with this progressive or bigot idea that you cannot, you're one or the other, but then also if you aren't, you will be suppressed, and it doesn't matter if you have any reasonable, specific, or whatever complaint. Now, I'll just add, before I open it up to the group, a quick comparison with another school in Virginia. That would be the infamous Rolling Stone investigation into the rape culture at the University of Virginia, which some younger listeners might not remember. This was sort of in the heyday of the rape culture conversation that Jezebel was foisting upon the country. And at the time when people read Jezebel, and this was a piece that came out in Rolling Stone that turned out to be utterly false. And yeah, you can go all the way back to the Duke allegations as well. But another Virginia school right there, the media was up in arms about the description that turned out to be false of this heinous crime. Rolling Stone's fact-checking fell apart quickly when it was subjected to public scrutiny. And now the media is blacking out this Daily Wire story. They don't want to talk about it. I'm sure local press is covering it, but the national media is utterly silent because it does not fit the narrative. So you can see on all of these fronts how the media is suppressing opposition and trying to manipulate our reality into one where this is not a problem. Because one story that is egregious and awful and does not fit the capital N narrative, well, we can't talk about that. And if we do, you'll be arrested at a school board meeting. So with that, I'll open it up to the group.
Well, it's not just the mainstream press, too. I mean, if you remember, this father, this Loudoun County father, he was cited by, I think, Merrick Garland and like the National School Board Association as like top example of hostility and, threats and violence at school board meetings. Well, come to find out, it was because he went to confront his own school board about not recognizing and not taking seriously the rape of his child. So, so forgive him a little bit of angst here, but yet he is the poster child for why, we have to, the DOJ has to go arrest parents at school boards and, under the Patriot Act, incarcerate them for violent threats. This entire story is just, it's earth shaking because it just demonstrates how powerful, to Emily's point, this national narrative is. If you don't agree with the talking points, you will be ignored. You will be ignored, and you will be, your story will be sort of just disappeared from the face of the national narrative. And that I think just is so concerning for, take the political causes out of it, just having a pluralist, self-government that operates on the free flow of information. So, that to me as a meta narrative is really concerning.
Yeah, let me just emphasize that point about the fact that this was cited as one of the examples in the National School Board Association letter calling on many agencies in the federal government using any and all statutes possible, including the Patriot Act, to investigate parents challenging school boards across the country, namely on issues like coronavirus policies and, of course, critical race theory, which, yes, then Merrick Garland wrote a memorandum responding to, saying that, yes, the FBI will be involved in working with various authorities to investigate such parents. If you go through those examples that are cited in the letter, and I've done so at Newsweek and elsewhere as well in a couple of different op-eds recently, you find that almost all of them fall apart. It isn't as if parents are acting like terrorists, of course. It's that parents are making their voices heard, passionately so. And the NSBA itself even cites some examples that were not even menacing calls to school boards. So it shows that the letter is a joke. But what is the broader point of that exercise? It is to chill challenge, scare into silence any parents who dare dissent from the regime ideology and the regime practices at schools, including, of course, critical race theory, which really is the ideology of our regime, supported by the Biden administration implicitly, and in some cases explicitly from the Department of Education. So I think on a couple levels, this is remarkable. First, that of course, this is just as baseless an example cited by the NSBA to target parents like terrorists as any of the other examples. Then the fact that this is on a story, an alleged rape, essentially taking advantage of the idea of transgender ideology, which the left would say, oh, this never happens. No one is ever targeted and menaced as a consequence of the sorts of bathroom policies, for example, that they support. So they have to cover it up because it's a threat to their political, the narrative that they wish to put forth. And then, of course, that this is cited as part of this broader regime to ensure that the regime ideology not dare be challenged by the tax-paying parents who are paying for the schools, and in many cases, the school boards themselves. I think this story is remarkable on any of a number of levels.
I really don't have a whole lot to add. I endorse everything that's already been said. I think Ben did a really nice job of underscoring why this is eye-opening here. To Emily's point, and I'm happy that she invoked Duke Lacrosse. I'm a Duke alum. I knew people on that team, actually. It's just to get another reminder of how kind of due process norms in both a criminal and just kind of like a broader civilizational, less tangible context really just do increasingly apply, and on kind of like an ad hoc basis based on kind of like the racial, sexual, ethnic, whatever identity of the person who is either accusing or is committing the crime here. I mean, really, the Duke Lacrosse thing in retrospect, I'm kind of thinking in real time here, was kind of like harrowingly prescient, if I can speak properly here, of what would happen to Brett Kavanaugh, 12 years after that here, right? I mean, you basically in both cases, you see these kind of like straight white Christian people that just completely thrown under the bus. They're just completely thrown under the bus as if thousands of years of due process norms just don't apply here. So obviously, this is kind of the reverse context. Obviously, there's the transgender issue, which is kind of like the third rail of all third rail issues here. But it's kind of it actually reminds me, I'm kind of rambling here, but it actually reminds me almost of the supply chain issue, which we kind of hinted at a little bit with Pete Buttigieg here. I mean, I'm going to like openly speculate here. Would the media, I feel pretty confident actually in just straight up asserting the media would not cover up for the transportation secretary being so absent during a massive supply chain crisis with the ports like this if he were a heterosexual secretary in a Republican administration. Like that's stating such an obvious point here, right? So we've gotten to the point where not only is America not quote unquote systemically racist or really kind of systemically bigoted and really in any sense of the term here. That's not to say, of course, obviously the like ad hoc one-on-one bigots don't exist. Of course they do, but this country is just not systemically bigoted in any way. But we have gone so far removed from that we as a society then give you kind of dole out such additional extra privileges and kind of extra media coverage, or in this case, bury media coverage when the underlying fact pattern entails someone at the top of the intersectional pyramid. So we saw that literally in the last story too with the Yale Law School. It's kind of like the running theme of this episode, I guess. And I just agree with everything that you guys have already said. It's an eye-opening experience here. Good for Luke Rosiak, by the way. That's good for him to get this story out there.
Yeah, and you guys all covered a really important point of this report, that in the myriad of things going on, I don't know if I made clear enough, the school district is accused of covering this up. The school district covered this up. So not only did all of this happen because of their bad policies, and not only did this end up hurting Scott, this actually was covered up. And so with that, I will transition. But what a story.
And worth noting, by the way, this was covered up, and we're just on the heels of the U.S. gymnasts who were exploited in the most horrific ways by Larry Nassar. And of course, it appears the FBI covered that up as well. And the FBI is the one targeting parents. So it all comes full circle here. I'm going to transition to talking a little bit about the latest in big tech, China collusion. Last week, there were several apps that Apple removed from the mainland China version of its app store, highly popular apps with millions of downloaders regarding both Bible reading and Quran reading as well. And essentially what Apple said was, look, we follow the laws of the countries in which we work. Of course they say that. And that's the excuse that's used by basically every major Western corporation to kowtow to the illiberal, fascistic demands of the Chinese Communist Party. And it's worth noting, by the way, the New York Times has actually done some very good work chronicling the numerous compromises that Apple has made to increase its market share in China. And of course, it has infrastructure based in China as well. So it's not just access to that marketplace, but also labor force as well. I want to, at a high level, flag this story or explain why I flagged this story. And I think it's this. I mean, Apple is sort of one of the big tech companies par excellence in the West. It used to be, at least, a symbol of innovation, entrepreneurship, and really a beacon of America. And Steve Jobs, of course, himself is heralded as sort of an epic figure in America. But here you have an putatively American big tech company censoring traditional religion-focused apps on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party, which cannot permit for any religion, but its state anti-religion of Marxism, Leninism. And I think that point ought to be underscored. It's Western societies Western companies working completely against the basis of Western civilization on behalf of the country that wishes to dominate us and eclipse our Western civilization. This is a commonplace story in terms of pulling down apps from the App Store or LinkedIn censoring profiles. In fact, LinkedIn has sent me a notice at one point, right on the eve of the Tiananmen Square anniversary this year, actually saying that parts of my profile wouldn't be accessible in China, likely because of things that I've written or outlets for which I've written. This is commonplace in our society, and we shouldn't accept this as commonplace. In fact, if we're actually going to compete with communist China long term, none of this can be accepted as commonplace. And I think this is sort of a measure of how far we are from actually competing when you think about all of the massive businesses for which this kind of conduct is completely tolerated. And basically, if there isn't a capital market response to it, something that kills top and bottom lines of these companies, then we're essentially whistling past the graveyard today, is my simple takeaway of it. So just to highlight a couple other points, high-level points that I think are worth making. This is once again proof that doing business with China corrupts us at the end of the day. Again, it proves perfectly the failure of the many decades-long policy of engagement with communist China. They corrupt us. We don't make China more like America when we do business with China. It's completely the opposite way around, in fact. It corrupts us in the West. This is also a huge part of China's influence operations. There are no greater influencers, effectively foreign agents on behalf of communist China, than the major businesses that transact with it on a daily basis. And if you look at the reporting, like Josh Rogan's book, for example, on US-China policy during the Trump years, he consistently goes back to the fact that the biggest lobbyists effectively on behalf of China were major executives in the financial services industry and other industries as well, America-based organizations, groups, corporations, precisely because of this compromise in effect from their dealings with communist China. The last point I'll make is that this comes against the backdrop of allegedly China launching a hypersonic missile, which, to the great surprise of our intelligence agency, is shock of all shocks, as well as, of course, the increasing threats, including the breaching of the airspace by dozens and dozens of Chinese aircraft of Taiwan. So this is the disconnect, the cognitive dissonance between what our corporations are doing as if they're operating in some separate ether, when in reality, of course, the economy is fundamentally what underpins the power of the Chinese Communist Party, at least on paper. I think it's amazing to consider the fact that you have our most formidable adversary flexing its muscle to unprecedented degrees. You have a Biden administration calling for, and this is Gina Raimondo, this Secretary of Commerce, saying that we need to have more engagement with China to cool temperatures. And then you have our corporations effectively acting on behalf of communist China in service of its drive for ideological dominance. So on every level, I think this is a disastrous story, but the fact that it's commonplace itself is maybe even more disastrous. And with that, I'll kind of just turn it over to the group for your thoughts.
I mean, one element of this is that, while these companies continue to do business in China, continue to defer in many cases to the Chinese. It's kind of like how I mentioned last week with Google and AI. These are our tip of the spear companies when it comes to the technological revolution and competition and, our national response to the threat from China. At the same time, when they are obviously hedging their bets with China, we rely on them as purportedly American companies, part of this grand national strategy to engage, on all of these areas of high tech research. These things cannot comport, right? These things are just opposite. And so to Ben's point, until there is a policy response, until there is something that actually reduces or eliminates this financial incentive, these companies can't be trusted. I mean, they themselves don't even call themselves American companies, right? Like they're citizens of the world or whatever the hell that means, right? So our policies have to reflect the reality. And for too long, I think we've just trusted this, sort of inherent patriotism, I think that we expect our companies to have. Well, our global system, our global economic system is just not designed for that to flourish. And so we need to acknowledge that reality and make policy accordingly.
The irony of this story, obviously, with this transparent collusion between big tech and the arch geopolitical foe of the United States of America, and by the way, just to emphasize something that we kind of hit on in final thoughts last episode: do not take the black pill, people. Okay, like America first, like both domestic and foreign policy, does not mean like Chai come first. So I know there are some of you probably listening that are floating in some like new right circles that hear some of this kind of Chi-com standing, for lack of a better term, is simping, we might say. Just don't take it, okay? That is just total and complete nonsense. But to get back to this story, like the irony of this obviously is that, when was it? It was last month, right? Where like, some group of kind of like ex-intelligence community officials who I think like universally now are like all on the dole, obviously, of like various like big tech paid lobbyists and whatnot, who basically fired a shot across the bow and said, like, do not break up these companies on antitrust grounds because national security, blah, 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 will undermine our great power competition with China. Look, if anything, like the complete opposite conclusion, as we briefly discussed on last week's podcast, happens to be the case here, is that these companies with this just incredible power that they wield here are increasingly like in their present form, a national security threat. I mean, like maybe it's not going to be like an existential threat today or tomorrow, but that is clearly the road that we're heading here. And, there's obviously a broader debate to be had here too, which Rachel is kind of getting at, and, way earlier, months and months ago, we kind of probably talked about it a little bit, which is what is the actual role of a profit-seeking corporation here, okay? You have this like very traditionalist kind of Milton Friedman perspective, which says obviously that the shareholder profit maximization is the sole and exclusive purpose of the corporation. There are some people that I think are challenging that here. Now, the notion of quote unquote stakeholder capitalism can quickly go off the rails if you imbue it with like a substantive wokeness. Obviously, BlackRock obviously is infamous with the ESG, environmental, social, and governance related investing. There's like trillions of dollars that have been committed to this form of investing, and if you look at the total AUMs, it's ludicrous. And Vivek Ramaswamy has spoken and written quite persuasively against it. But that doesn't mean necessarily that it is kind of the best from kind of like a NatCon, a common good interest, that is necessarily best for there to be zero guardrails whatsoever, and to allow these increasingly all-powerful conglomerates to just simply pursue profits at any and all costs at the expense of whatever, whether it's kind of like the heartland or whether it's national security. So these are interesting debates, I think, that a lot of people on the right are having. And I think this episode in particular really just shines a spotlight on that as well.
So BBC reported that the app was removed for hosting illegal religious texts, and that could be broad. That could mean a lot of things. It's obviously an enormously popular app, so it's hard to believe that there was any like overt pro fundamentalist terrorist messaging on it. That I'm sure will be the CCP's contention as this plays out, or if they even bother to provide more of an explanation, or if reporters are even able to get more to the bottom of it. That will be, and by the way, there's an article on this in The Verge, which is basically insistently bending over backwards to defend Apple and to say what a difficult situation they're in. And I just want to say that that is extremely dangerous language, because the more that we say this is a difficult decision, the more we condition ourselves to see this as a moral gray area. There is no moral gray area when it comes to this level of intense financial cooperation with China, because boosting their economy boosts the CCP, and the CCP's goal is to undercut the United States of America. So the more business that you do with the CCP, the more that you help them control and manipulate information and their own people, the more you're actually undercutting the country that gave you the freedom to develop your products, and gave you the sort of space for innovation and development to get this rich in the first place. And so if you can accept that that system did that for you and is worth defending, this is not a moral gray area. You need to take care of this immediately. And when you have this language in places like The Verge, that I'm sure is very well sourced at Apple and is doing that to maintain its relationship with Apple, the article is just, like I said, bending over backwards to say, well, Apple's in such a tough spot, they make so much money in China, blah, blah, blah. The more that we let that be okay, the more that these companies are going to have no incentives to actually back off of it, because this is black and white. This is oppression. And don't listen to the people who are trying to feed you the black pill about how this is a CIA disinformation operation. Are there people in the United States that are itching for war with China over Taiwan? Probably, but the reporting on the CCP's human rights abuses is extensive, and it is not all a CIA disinformation campaign. Do not take the black pill on this issue. China wants to undercut us. They are abusing their own citizens' freedoms and rights in the process, and we cannot allow our major corporations to continue doing business with them, because it's allowing us to just cut ourselves off at the knees.
So let's transition to final thoughts here. So this is kind of a wide-ranging episode, but there were some themes that percolated throughout. So does anyone want to kick us off here?
I can start just on going back to the discussion of, I think, what you brought up, Josh, about sort of this insanity happening at Yale Law School. A story broke while we were covering this about something from Oberlin College, a student who is a resident of Baldwin College, Baldwin College is specifically at Oberlin, a college for sort of women and trans collective. That's kind of what it's called. And this person published in the Oberlin Review that she was upset that male cisgender males, so straight males, were allowed into her college to fix the radiator. Quotes include that she, felt violated by it, all these things. And it kind of goes back to this idea that, like, again, Oberlin is considered a very sort of prestigious, high-end school. These people are going to come out and run America. And this is kind of, I'm not sure, like, they are going to run into cisgender men, and that is going to be the thing that, like, melts everybody down. It's like we've created at once this level of insanity and fragility that is just not compatible with democracy, self-government, interfacing in a social universe. And so again, we always come back to the sort of fate of higher ed, but there has to be an unplugging of these colleges and universities, because America cannot sustain this kind of fragility.
So my final thought is really similar to that. So I'll just jump on this quickly. I think we have a podcast coming out this week on how popular Hillsdale's sort of alternative curriculum has been. And it's got like a crazy number of downloads in the past year. And this is what's important, because that's the way to unplug it, is to build up parallel infrastructures. And because of the splintering of the marketplace right now, that is more possible than ever before. That's why we've talked several times about the Daily Wire building up a parallel Hollywood infrastructure, because they can find funding and the barrier to entry is a little bit lower now to compete with the big guys. And we'll see if it works out, but it's happening on Substack. Basically every industry now has its own kind of version of Substack. We're seeing conservative wine. We're seeing all of these different things. And that's how you stop it, because there's a very much an appetite and a hunger among some section of the population that is significant. I don't know how big it is, but you can look at the homeschooling boom, which did not just happen among, say, white families. Like this had happened across demographics and is very impressive. There is an appetite for Joe Rogan. There is an appetite for Barry Weiss. There is an appetite for all of these podcasts like this. There's an appetite for that. And the goal now is to feed it in constructive and major ways. And, to the extent that we cannot change academia, absolutely true. That is entrenched at this point. And we are going to be dealing with a generation of people who believe that they live in Jim Crow. we cannot underestimate that. What we have to do is build up powerful institutions that can give them the alternative information, because they know, many of them know instinctively that they're missing something and they can be persuaded.
So I'll just quickly,
go ahead, Josh. No, well, go ahead.
Okay, so I'll just quickly jump in, because on the same theme of higher ed corruption here, I'll make this actually a quick point of personal privilege. So I'm traveling to 3 university campuses this week. On Thursday, I'm doing this big tech event that I think Rachel was initially invited to, and then so graciously, I'm very happy to play the Robin for her absent Batman on Thursday at Grand Valley State University on Thursday. But before that, I'm giving 2 law school talks on Wednesday, one back on my alma mater, UFC, and then the other at Northwestern. The Northwestern talk is going to be on common good originalism, which is kind of my somewhat idiosyncratic theory of constitutional interpretation. We've talked about it on this podcast. No reason to spend any more time on the substantive kind of merits or lack thereof, potentially, of that theory. But what's interesting is that the school listserv, emails of which have been forwarded to me by students there, it's just going ballistic. Like I am being called like a vitriolic transphobe on like all these like all school, like school-wide listserv emails here. So listen to this. Quote, Hammer's support of common good originalism is also not ideologically separate from his hatred of trans people. In a piece co-written by Hammer for The American Mind, a publication of the conservative think tank, the Claremont Institute, common good originalism is offered as a reaction to Neil Gorsuch's opinion in Bostock, a case that extended Title VII protections to transgender individuals. Hammer and his co-authors called the case a, quote, travesty, and characterized the outcome as a moral failing. Well, I mean, guilty as charged, honestly. I'm not going to like push back against that. That is definitely my stance. But they're apparently going to like actually like pass out flyers beforehand all around the law school, and they're going to do a formal protest in like the back of the classroom and like physically turn their backs to me when I talk here. So just like the infantilization of these people and like the complete inability to like take any kind of moderately sober contrasting view seriously, it just really just exacerbates everything we talked about here. Yale, Oberlin, Loudoun County. I mean, God, if America is going to be salvaged, honestly, I really do wonder like where the heck we're going to educate our children. And like Hillsdale is fantastic, but as of now, there's only one Hillsdale. So we've got to get the funders out there and the grassroots work to build more Hillsdales, basically, I guess.
Well, Josh, be safe over on campus, and best of luck staring down the mob, or I guess if they have their backs to you, you'll be staring at their backs, but good luck out there, and be safe, because there are obviously insane people out there who really do believe that speech is violence, and that justifies their physical violence. I'll end on one positive note, and this is actually from Axios over the weekend. They reported, and I'll quote here, enrollment in traditional public schools decreased by more than 1 million students in the 2020 to 21 school year, a 3% drop. Enrollment in public charter schools increased by 7% in the same period, and more parents chose options, including private schools and homeschooling. So if there is one silver lining to the disastrous, cataclysmic coronavirus policies when it comes to our kids, and then also an antidote to the horrors that we're seeing in terms of the indoctrination of generation after generation in these schools, it's that parents are beginning to opt out. And that's a positive thing that we can look towards. But obviously, we need more than just Hillsdale. We need many other organizations as well to ensure that our future generations aren't anti-American generations of kids.
All right. Well, on that note, a healthy and fun and energetic conversation as always here. So on behalf of Ben, Emily, Rachel, thanks for tuning in. I am Josh Hammer. We will see you at the next NatCon Squad.